David Campanella, who I was really pleased to meet last summer, is the Public Policy Research Manager for the Parkland Institute and is based in Calgary. David received his master's degree from York University, where he studied environmental politics and focused on the political history of carbon capture and storage in Alberta's oil and gas industry.
Fabulous to see everybody here tonight. Thank you very much to the council for having me come and speak. Really appreciate being able to talk to such an important issue. And on a Tuesday night, a rainy Tuesday night, it's nice to see so many faces here to come and hear about it. So I'm going to be taking you through a short trip through the world of oil and gas royalties. And before, on this journey, I'd like you to remember two things. The first thing is that energy policy is political. That's very important to remember. It's too often framed as solely as an economic decision, economically determined. And therefore, good policy becomes the policy that feeds into this predetermined economic path, and bad policy is that which opposes it. But energy policy is much more than that. It's about who benefits, who pays the costs, who bears the risk, and it's about what sort of collective future we want to determine. And energy is a huge part of that. And whether some free market ideologues want to believe it or not, the government does have a role to play in shaping energy production. And it's up to us to determine if and how these resources are developed. Too often, I think you might relate to this, that type of framework is used to try and distance the public from energy policy. You know, it's too complicated. It's not for the public to say. They don't understand how complicated this is. And I mean, in the height of the royalty review, one energy analyst actually came out and said as much. His name was Peter Linder, and he said, quote unquote, the public has and should have really no say in this matter because they don't understand the intricacies of the royalty system. But we know that's not really how a democratic system works, and there are alternatives. And the second thing to remember is don't get depressed. There's going to be some big numbers coming out, and so anger is okay. Anger can be motivating, but try not to go down the depression route. Okay, so first off, let's just take a snapshot of the state of the oil and gas industry. This is straight from the Energy and Resources Conservation Board. The light green there is conventional natural gas, and the darker green is the bitumen production. And as you can see, Alberta was predominantly a natural gas producing province until very recently. It's starting to switch over to bitumen province, and past that middle gray line there is forecast. So that dynamic is forecasted to intensify. And another way of sort of saying the same thing, this is the drilling history in Alberta. And the gray bars there are natural gas. So you can see, I don't know if you can make it out in the back there, but starting in about the late 1990s, there's an enormous boom in natural gas drilling. Enormous. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, bitumen production really started to take off as well. And yeah, so that's also saying the same sort of thing, is that the switch from natural gas to bitumen. So taking a closer look at the oil sands, tar sands, what have you. The latest estimates for production is about 1.2 million barrels per day. That's there on the operating side, and then there's all kinds of projects in different stages along the development pathway. And if we add all those up together, we are looking at over 4 million barrels per day production in the oil sands. So production to this point has been predominantly through mining, mostly just two projects, Suncor and Syncrude. But the vast majority of the bitumen deposit in northern Alberta is too deep to mine. So we will be seeing a shift towards more in situ production in the future. Okay, so that will have to do for now for a brief overview of sort of how the industry is shaping up. And we'll go into how the actual revenue that's being generated is being distributed between the industry and the public. This graph here is something that should outrage everybody in the room. The blue line there shows the share of the revenue generated in the oil and gas industry that actually goes to the public. And you'll notice a rather sharp decline beginning in the late 90s to today. So during Lougheed's time, at the peak of the public share, we were getting about 40% of all that revenue from oil, gas, and bitumen. 40%. And in recent times, that's fallen through the floor. And this is a major public policy disaster in Alberta. So this graph here shows the entire 41-year history of the PC party, starting in 1971 to 2010. The red dotted lines are the targets for what those different premiers actually wanted to be getting for in terms of revenue. Lougheed set it at 35%. Klein initially set it at 20 to 30 and then dropped it down to 20 to 25. And then you can see that it ends in 2009. And that's because Stelmach, during his time, just ceased that policy tool altogether. That no longer shapes Alberta's royalties, how they set the royalties anymore. That's done. It doesn't matter. They don't factor that in. What percentage the public should be getting. And in recent years, it's gotten pretty low. So in 2009, it hit 10%. In 2010, it was 13%. And not shown in this graph, in 2011, it was an all-time low of 9%, despite an upturn in the economic conditions. So obviously we should be asking ourselves, why was Lougheed able to do something that the future premiers were not capable of? And some will argue that, well, prices have increased, so a larger share of the revenue is going to pay for costs, therefore not going to the public. But that doesn't quite square because, as we know, the oil price has skyrocketed through those times as well. It used to be about $25 a barrel in the mid to late 1990s, and it's now hovering around $100 a barrel. And this also shows the importance of keeping in mind relative figures. The Alberta government, they sort of love to boast in absolute numbers about how big the royalties are. You know, they'll throw out numbers like 6 billion, 7 billion. And it sounds like a lot of money, but it's important to keep in mind how that relates to the actual revenue coming out of the industry, and therefore how much of that share is going to the public. So in the middle of that gas boom, at the height of that gas boom in 2005, Albertans received $8.4 billion in gas royalties. And that's a big number. By all accounts, that's a large, very large sum of money. But the industry that year produced $42 billion worth of gas. So that means Albertans were only receiving 20% at that time. And as you can see, I mean, where is that gas boom in those years? Shouldn't there be, you know, a big spike or something? But there's not. It hardly even 20%. I mean, that's just the bottom of the target at the time. So something was amiss. And before anyone can try to justify this downward trend by arguing that the oil companies are feeling the pinch too, you know, their margins are really tight. Not that anyone in this room would argue that, but some might. Let's take a look at how they've been doing. So this bar graph, it's not just the industry's profits. It's the industry's excess profits. And what makes them excess is that they're over and above the standard corporate rate of 10% return on their capital investment. So if you This is on top of a 10% return. Anything that any businessman, any businesswoman would be very happy earning, 10%. That's great. This is over and above that. So what we've seen is that between 1999 and 2009, the industry as a whole regularly made excess profits of over $20 billion. And in 2008, that's that scary looking one that's quite massive. It was $54 billion in excess profits. And over the entire decade, when you add up all those years, it was $129 billion in the conventional industry and $162 billion in the tar sands industry. And from the recent forest ethics report that came out, I don't know if anyone saw that last week or so, we now know how much of these profits don't actually, not only don't stay in Alberta, but don't stay in Canada. 71% of tar sands production is owned by non-Canadian shareholders, and 41% of all industry profits go to foreigners. So that's a lot of money that's being extracted from Alberta's ground and then dissipating across the southern and other borders. So a major part of this overall trend toward a royalty framework that's heavily skewed in favor of the oil industry has been the increased prominence of the tar sands in the province's fossil fuel portfolio and how this has been managed. So this graph here shows the absolute and relative benefits to the public from the oil sands production since 1986. If you can't, so the purple is the profits, and the blue and the green are the royalties and land sales. So that's the share that goes to the public. And if you can't see that in the back, it's not because you need glasses or anything. It's just really small. It's very, very small. Since 1986, more than $285 billion worth of resources have been produced from the oil sands. $285 billion. From that, $260 billion went to the industry in pre-tax profits, and to the public went $25 billion. Went $25 billion in royalties and land sales. So that's a large sum of money. But you've got to keep it in mind relative to the amount being extracted. And that's only 9% of the total revenue that's come out of the oil sands industry. In 2010 alone, the last year on this graph, $36.6 billion of resources were exchanged for $4 billion in royalties and land sales. Now, keen observers will notice that there's something missing from this graph. That's costs. But there's a reason that there's no costs included on this graph, and that's because in the long term, there are no real costs to the tar sands industry. We have a royalty framework that essentially refunds these companies through a heavily discounted royalty rate. So until they reach their payout period, until they are able to extract enough bitumen to count for all the operating and capital costs that they've incurred, as well as the cost of borrowing the money, as well as the initial royalty payments that they've made. At that time, that's when the main royalty rate kicks in. So we're basically giving them royalty-free, virtually, bitumen to pay off their costs. So it's the public paying for this industry's construction through our resources. And we're often told that the payout's going to come in the future. The real money for the public in this industry is going to come in 5 or 10 years. It's going to come down the road. But how do we know for sure what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years? It's kind of a long time these days. And who knows what kind of intervention the oil companies might make to try to push those timelines back. So it's certainly not for sure. And we know for a fact, looking at the budget that the PC party released before the election, that according to their own numbers, in 2014-2015 fiscal year, they still only plan to capture 12% of the bitumen revenue. So not exactly skyrocketing in the near future. A more accurate idea, though, of the distribution of the wealth here comes through the concept of economic rent. So rather than revenue, economic rent. And economic rent is the sum of dollars that are left over after you subtract from the total revenue, costs to produce, and a standard rate of profit, the 10% that we were talking about earlier. It's basically the surplus profit. And the oil industry is like a zero-sum game. That surplus profit is either going to go to the oil companies or it's going to go to the public. So it's either them or us. So it gets split somehow. And as the owners of the resources, we have the right to 100% of that surplus profit. 100%. And if we choose not to collect 100%, that's a subsidy that we're choosing to give to the industry to help them produce more in the future or what have you. That's up to us. Yeah. So let's look at the conventional sector. Even when you go through economic rent, the government doesn't exactly have a good track record here. The blue bar there, this isn't my best graph, but I need better software. That's coming in the future. So this blue bar here is the economic rent target of the government, 50 to 75%. That's how much they plan to capture through those years. And the red line is what they actually did. So, 2 out of 10 years, they managed to get into their target. And, from 2000 to 2005, that's the natural gas boom, where there was enormous money being made and natural gas being drilled, and that's what we were able to accomplish. But as you can probably guess, it's even more pronounced when we look at the oil sands. So this is the distribution of the rent year by year in the oil and gas industry when you're accounting for the fact that there are no real long-term costs. That's our share at the bottom there in the blue, and that's abysmal. On average, through those years, less than 10% of the rent, over a decade, less than 10% went to the public, and they never collected more than 20%. 20% is not a lot. And so when we say that it's not a lot, and when we are trying to frame this and deal with these numbers, it's important to keep in mind what's happening internationally. And unfortunately, these are rather difficult figures to get a hold of. So if anyone has any leads, let me know. That'd be great. But this is a little outdated. It's from the Royalty Review Panel in 2007. So it doesn't account for the slight changes that came in after that royalty review in the oil sands. But what they found at that time was that Alberta was the lowest in conventional, and Alberta had the lowest take in when they compared the oil sands to comparable resources around the world. And that doesn't even, on these slides, it's not even accounting for the national oil companies, which dominate the international market, where they regularly collect, nearly 100% of the rent because they're doing the production. And just a brief bit on government take, which is what the Royalty Review Panel uses, government take. So that's why the numbers, you can't really see them, and they're not that important actually, but the idea of government take, just to take a second here, what that encompasses is it merges together both royalties and taxes, and it merges them into one number of what the overall sort of government take would be from the oil companies. But it's critical to, I would argue, to keep those separate, to keep taxes and royalties separate. They're two fundamentally different things. Royalties are what we charge for allowing oil companies private oil companies to come and extract our resources and profit from that business. And taxes are totally separate. Taxes are faced by every industry, and they're there to pay for the collective services that help those businesses operate in our province. So all this relative share talk, what does this actually mean in dollars? Well, to get an estimate of the public cost of these policy decisions in the future, we asked the question, what would have happened if the government had met its top target of 75% of the economic rent? So in that graph I showed earlier with the blue bar, if it had met 75% in those years, well, we found that it would have been an extra $67 billion to the Alberta government in those 10 years. Now that's a large sum of money, and that could have been in the public coffers, in a savings fund, somewhere collecting interest and helping pay for our social programs. And instead what happened, and also we looked at the figure of 50% in the oil sands, and 50% of the rent, so lower than in conventional, and that was $82 billion over the last decade. And if we had kept Lougheed's target of 35% of the oil and gas revenue, so that red line that was across the top, that he even surpassed in a couple of years, if the Alberta government had managed to meet that target of revenue over the course of the 41 years of PC dominance in this province, that would have been an extra $195 billion. $195 billion. Then we're talking about a real heritage savings fund. And that's one of those large numbers that can be kind of shocking. And so to put it in a more sort of a form that's more readily grasped, if you put it in a per person, per capita form, it's $55,000, $55,714 per person in this province. So substantial. So what lies ahead? What with that kind of past, and we have to remember that those decisions are in the past. It's not exactly like we can go back and somehow get that money. Those are mistakes that have been made in the past, but we have the option to start shaping the future and choose a different type of development strategy. Well, as I mentioned, in the PCs tabled their budget, and they plan to capture 12% of the bitumen revenue in several years down the road. But overall, even if you look at oil, gas, and bitumen over those years, over the next 3 fiscal years, it's still 9 to 12%. So it's still, on that historical graph, it's still right at the bottom. And that has serious implications for our public wealth, for our public fiscal well-being. If we instead restore Lougheed's, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the policy that we should adopt, but just hypothetically, if you're looking for a number, go back to a past PC premier. It's kind of hard to argue with that. So he set a target of 35%. If we brought that back and even held a lower 25% target in the oil sands, we're talking quite a bit of additional revenue. That's supposed to show up at the bottom there, but it's $17 billion this year and $19 billion in both the next year and the following year. So a total of $55 billion that could be captured in that one single policy move in the next 3 years. Not simple, but one hypothetical change. So how is this sort of thing, how is this much revenue being slipping through our fingers? And one of the clearest reasons of this is the royalty framework that's in place right now in the oil sands. It's badly out of date. It was written 15 years ago, mainly by the oil industry through the National Oil Sands Task Force, and adopted in principle and in the main by the government at the time, Premier Ralph Klein. And that's what set up this sort of two-tiered royalty system that I was describing earlier, where at the beginning, up until 2009, when the changes came in, it was 1% at the beginning, royalty charge, until all the costs are recouped, and then it bounces up to 25%. So that two-tiered structure ensures that the majority of the profits are going to go to the oil industry because it's the public assuming the burden of the cost. And after the royalty framework, there were some slight modifications. That two-tiered system still in place, but what happens now is that the rates, both the pre-payout rate and the post-payout rate, both change with the price in oil. But there's a cap on that, so if the price ever goes over 120 barrels in oil, it doesn't matter. The rates are still capped at a certain rate. The other thing we need to keep in mind here when we talk about alternatives is something that the government has clearly missed out on, and that is the very strong bargaining position that Alberta has in terms of its resources. So something that's not often talked about in this province, but something that's not often publicly recognized, is that the vast majority of global oil reserves aren't accessible to the private oil companies, the ones that are operating here in this province. 80% of the world's reserves are held in OPEC countries. That only leaves 20% for the private oil companies to compete over. And 62% of that oil that's available to the private oil companies is here in Alberta. Over half of the reserves that they're able to target are here. And these are the proven economical reserves. These are the ones that we know how to produce and that they can be produced at a profit. So, I mean, this is the bargaining position that Alberta really has, and it's being squandered through policies trying to lure as much investment as possible. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's not even just the private oil companies that are the ones operating here. They're also being competed. There's also competition from the state-owned oil companies, the national oil companies. Think of Statoil, Norway's oil company, and oil companies from China as well. These are also big players coming into this market, competing with the private oil majors, and they've tried desperately over the last 10 years to replace their reserves. So as you produce your oil, you also want to be making sure that you've got more oil down the tube that's coming, that's going to be ready to produce as well. And that's proven to be very difficult for the private oil companies. And they've, as we've seen, they've had to resort to things like deep offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and other places, trying to explore in the Arctic for oil and for future reserves. So those are very costly and risky endeavors. And what we have here in Alberta is quite viable and quite enviable. And one of the main reasons, though, why we hear that nothing can be done, we can't possibly change royalties, is look at what happened last time. Royalties changed and the oil companies left. Well, that's not exactly what happened. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous to talk about the impact of the royalty review and the slump in industry activity around that time without mentioning two major global events that happened around the same time. And one, of course, is the global recession. And that was a major economic event. We're still feeling the effects from that, and it decimated the price of oil. And so obviously, investment's going to follow with the price of oil, and it did decline. The other is the shale gas boom that happened in North America. And this had a major impact on the Alberta province. Like I was showing earlier with some of those graphs, we were a predominantly natural gas producing province. And so all of a sudden, you've got this major new supply that totally changed the market dynamics. And it went from a market of scarcity and high price to one of abundance and low price. And again, with price goes investment. And so drilling did decline in the province. But it was also widespread. this decline in natural gas drilling. Between 2006 and 2010, it could decline 75% in Alberta. That's a major impact on the economy. But it also declined 69% in BC and 95% in Saskatchewan. And I didn't, maybe I just missed it, but I didn't hear any royalty reviews happening in those provinces. So it would be very, it's very, I would argue, scandalous to try and claim that the downturn in activity was due to the royalty review without mentioning these two major events. Finally, I'd just like to give a touch to some recent reports that Parkland has put out that I think really do substantiate a good case for alternatives. Where this mentality that development will happen, development must happen, and development must happen in this way is sometimes overpowering in our public discourse. And it's very important, I think, to keep in mind that there are alternative ways to approach this development. And I would argue that some of our reports make pretty good cases around that, and would suggest that anyone interested goes to check them out. Parklandinstitute.ca. I can get into, I thought for time's sake I wouldn't necessarily go into what those alternatives actually are. I know that's kind of probably something everyone's thinking about, but I could mention maybe some of that in the Q&A if we like. But I would just like to say thank you very much. And one last point, sorry, is just to say that it's very important, I think, not to let this issue fall out of the public discourse. And it was rather incredible, I think, to watch through the provincial election campaign this issue just be totally absent on the radar. I mean, this is one of the most important policy decisions in Alberta, let alone Canada. And we had an election in this province that hardly mentioned it at all. And it's fairly easy to see why that might be when 3 out of the 4 main parties all had in their platform a position of not changing royalties. So when there's that kind of broad consensus, where's the debate? But that debate's got to come from us. And as some of the polls showed at the beginning of the election, a majority of Albertans do think that we're not getting our fair share. 58% of Albertans don't think they're getting their fair share, and that includes 70% of Edmontonians. That's a rather overwhelming number, and I think it shows the strength of character of this province, and that we won't let this issue die away. So thank you very much for coming out tonight.